COPPPAL-ICAPP, Honorable José de Valencia.
Excellencies, Senor Presidente Pedro Joaquin Caldwell, President of PRI, COPPAL Chairman Antonio Cafiero, and Vice President Gustavo Carvajal, my co-chairman, Ambassador Chung Wei-Yung of the Republic of Korea, delegates from Asia, delegates from Latin America, delegates from Africa, the great Mexican people, my friends, ladies and gentlemen. This increasing interaction between our groupings is especially gratifying for me because it recalls the historic era that President Caldwell spoke about when Mexico and the Philippines for 250 years traded with each other. The first instance of globalization, the first instance of traffic between Asia and Latin America. In this great Acapulco-Manila galleon trade, where goods from China and the goods from Japan and the goods from India and Ceylon and Pakistan and Malaysia and Indonesia were brought to the Philippines. And the great whaling ships went from Manila Bay to the Pacific, to Mexico. At that time, there was no Suez Canal, there was no Panama Canal, there was no Texas, there was no California. But it was the biggest instance of brilliant trade between Mexico and the Philippines and Spain and Europe. Today, Mr. President, and to our President-elect Enrique Peña Nieto, we would like to see a revival of this great and glorious galleon trade. And we would like Mexico to take the lead, as it took the lead before, for more than 250 years. Together with Brazil and Argentina and the members of the G20, and the African nations are here represented by another member of the G20, South Africa. And the other members of the G20 from Asia, South Korea beside me. And Indonesia was also represented here. And Japan and India, who is also represented here by the son of the Prime Minister of India. My friends, it was only 12 years ago that we organized ICAPP in the city of Manila. And today it has grown from 40 political parties to 300 political parties, ruling parties and opposition parties and independent parties. And we have close interaction with each other twice a year, 3 times a year, and have a general assembly once every 2 years. But one of our single biggest achievements is the close partnership, the interaction, the coalition between COPPAL and ICAPP, represented by Antonio Cafiero, that legendary statesman from Argentina, who is represented here by his grandson Antonio, and by Gustavo Carvajal, who is the Vice President of COPPAL and who has attended almost every great meeting in Asia. He is a very able spokesman for Mexico and for the people of Latin America. We learn many things from Mexico. The conditional cash transfer program that President Aquino is now following. Bangladesh, Indonesia, and Cambodia have their own versions of the CCT program. Also in the Philippines and in Asia, we're looking to Mexico's great example in our effort to raise our electoral system beyond the reach of partisan politics. Only a few months ago, Chairman Chung and I were invited as guests of PRI and of the Mexican government to observe the elections. And we found in our observation of the elections in Mexico City and other parts of Mexico that the efficiency of the Federal Electoral Institute, the professionalism of the IFE officials that we met, and the implicit trust the Mexican people have in place of this new electoral institution. I must say I was just as impressed by President-elect Enrique Peña Nieto, whom we met briefly on election eve, accompanied by Gustavo Carvajal, who with Argentina leader Antonio Cafiero are perhaps among Latin America's enduring senior statesmen. President Peña Nieto seems to exemplify the kind of dynamic, technocratic leadership Mexico needs if it is to realize its vision of political and economic modernization and to continue its ascent in the ranks of the G20 and the global community. Deeper and more constant interaction will also open for Asia and Latin America and the Caribbean opportunities for joint initiatives in the international arena. Today, we in ICAPP in Asia, representing Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, West Asia, the entire Arab world, and Australia and New Zealand, representing 60% of the world's population, together with Latin America and with Africa, who are all represented here. We represent more than 75% of the population of the world gathered here in this great hall of the people. And we say that with our partnership and the beginnings of this new tripartite alliance of three continents, Asia, Latin America, and Africa, we can present a strong, united front before the United Nations, before the world, before the international community. And I believe, and I ask that perhaps in our next meeting in China with Minister Aiping here representing the Communist Party of China, I would like to congratulate China because China has invested heavily in the development of Latin America, in the development of Asia, and in the development of Africa. Let's give a big hand to the People's Republic of China. We must also congratulate India because India is now beginning to reach out to Latin America, to Asia, and to Africa. We must congratulate the small but dynamic nation of South Korea, together with Indonesia, together with Malaysia, and together with the Philippines, because with the ASEAN 10 plus 3, which is plus China, plus India, plus Japan, and plus South Korea, now we're expanding it to include Australia and New Zealand in one great historic alliance. And we are reaching not only within the borders of Asia, but beyond, to the nations of the Pacific, to Peru, to the nations along the Pacific Rim, to Mexico. A revival of the old galleon trade, Mr. President. And I think that Mexico and the Latin American countries along the Pacific have a great historic role to play as we try to create one global community. My friends, we have, in the course of our meeting here in Mexico, a meeting of all the political parties, we're also introducing for the first time the establishment of a COPPPAL-ICAPP Business Council, or an Asian Latin American Economic Council, because we should complement the work of our political parties with economic action, with joint ventures, with economic partnerships among the business leaders of Latin America and Asia, and eventually to include the business leaders of Africa. And I hope, Mr. President, that the political party of PRI and the government of Mr. Peña Nieto and the governments represented here would attend our meeting in the next few hours to launch for the first time in history the ICAPP COPPAL Business Council, which was first proposed by that legendary Argentine business political leader, Antonio Cafiero, when we met in San Salvador in the presence of Senator Mushahid, in the presence of the Deputy Prime Minister of Nepal, who is here, and in the presence of Ambassador Chung and myself, and we immediately supported this program because I believe it represents a very concrete proposal for creating and developing political and economic integration between Asia and Latin America. For in the international community, our three continents, by working together, can become the stabilizing element in the emerging multilateral global balance of power. The center of political gravity is moving away from the Atlantic, clearly, where it has been for the last 150 years, because other power centers are rising in relative strength in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa. Reflecting the rise of the new stakeholders in the global community, the G20 is beginning to exert its influence on the economic governance of the international community. Over the next few years, G20 would supersede the World Bank and the IMF combined, dominated by the Western powers. Born at the beginning of the 2008 global recession, the G20, of which Mexico is a leading member, is made up of the old G7, later G8, economic elite, plus a dozen of the top emerging economies, including Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. Already the G20 has decided to reassign the IMF's voting rights to reflect the weight of its new shareholders. My dear friends, as we see these geopolitical movements in Asia, Latin America, and Europe, and in the world, we see some decline in Europe. We see some decline in America. But the nations of Latin America and the nations of Africa are holding firm, and the nations of Asia are holding firm. But as we see these geopolitical movements, we see that there are signals of a re-emergence of the Cold War between East and West. And this, we in Asia, we in Latin America, we in Africa do not want to see a return of the Cold War in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, or in the South China Sea. I believe that the United States of America and China, the two leading powers in the world today, of course, together with the European Union, we should not be made to choose between America and China. We should not be made to choose between this country and the European Union. I believe we in Latin America, we in Asia, we in Africa should support jointly the United States and China. These are two countries that we should nourish, we should support, we should strengthen, because the two of them together can help the economy of the world. In short, we should not be made to choose, because we choose both. Both China and America are good for Asia, they are good for Latin America, they are good for Africa, and they are good for the world. Let me say, my dear friends, that as part of our agenda here in Latin America, here in Mexico, we would like to dedicate the political parties of COPPAL, to dedicate the political parties of ICAPP, to dedicate the political parties of Latin America to the battle against climate change. We have here Dr. Jiang Minjung. He is president of the largest anti-climate change organization in the world, with headquarters in Beijing and in New York and in St. Petersburg. And we would like to invite you to our annual meeting in Bali, Indonesia, on December 9 to 12, where more than 800 delegates from all over the world will come, in order that we can concentrate our strategies and our energies in the battle against climate change. Congratulations to you, Dr. Jiang. And we ask as many of you who would come to be the guests of the International Ecological Safety Organization in Bali. Also, we have met with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon last night, yesterday afternoon in New York, with Ambassador Chung and the members of the Executive Committee. We proposed to Ban Ki-moon that because of the increasing conflict between Christians and Muslims, the increasing conflict even between Buddhists and Hindus in Southeast Asia, because of the increasing conflict between Muslims and Buddhists in southern Thailand, because of the emergence of extremist religious groups in the wake of the Arab Spring in various parts of the world, we have asked Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to revive the global Christian-Muslim interfaith dialogues, because they were so successful in the years following the attack in New York. And there has been a stabilization because of this revival of this global interfaith dialogue. Mexico, a Christian country. Latin America, a Christian country. The Philippines, a Christian country. Europe, largely a Christian country. But Asia, you have Buddhist Asia, you have Confucian Asia, you have Muslim Asia, you have Hindu Asia. That is the reason why the time has come for us to call for a meeting of all the great religions of the world under the aegis and under the sponsorship of the United Nations and under the leadership of COPPAL, under the leadership of ICAPP, and under the leadership of the African political parties. Together, we must renew our dedication, our energies, and our efforts, for after all, we belong to one great human family under God. This is my proposal to each and everyone. Lastly, in the United Nations, we have asked Dr. Ban Ki-moon. ICAPP has made proposals to create the Asian Anti-Poverty Fund. We want to create the Asian Anti-Poverty Fund because only governments are able to get money from the World Bank and from the IMF. But the small businessmen needing only $1,000, the small businessman needing only $500 or $5,000 cannot access the IMF or the World Bank or the Latin American Development Bank or the Asian Development Bank. Therefore, we need to create an anti-poverty fund sponsored by ICAPP, sponsored by COPPAL, sponsored by the African political parties, so that our small businessmen needing only very small loans, microfinance loans, can access these great institutions. Finally, let me say that the poorer nations of the world must have debt relief. There's too much global indebtedness that generation after generation after generation cannot repay and service the debt of governments and of nations. There has to be a formula for working out a reduction of the global debt. And we, the political parties of ICAPP and of COPPAL and of the Latin American political parties, can work together a formula, and I ask you, Mr. President, to create a small working group of Asians and Latin Americans and Africans to see how we can work out a program to reduce, if not, to reduce, if not lessen, the global debt of the more than 120 of the most heavily indebted nations of the world. My friends, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you, Mr. President, for your hospitality, for your friendship, for the leadership of PRI. We had a very brief chance with Ambassador Chung to sit down with Senor Carvajal, with President Peña Nieto, but it was only for 2 minutes. But I promised to write him a letter, and I wrote him a letter to propose that under his leadership, Mexico should perhaps call a global summit of all the nations of the world in order that all the nations of the world can do battle with the global narcotics cartels, because the global narcotics cartels are prejudicing not only Mexico, but prejudicing America, prejudicing Asia, prejudicing Latin America, prejudicing almost all the nations of the world. And the time has come for all the great nations of the world to come together under the auspices of the United Nations to tackle the problem of narcotics. Narcotics in Afghanistan, narcotics in the Philippines, narcotics in Pakistan, narcotics in the Golden Triangle, narcotics in the Russian mafia, narcotics in the US, narcotics in almost every region of the world. And the time has come for us, acting through the political parties of Latin America and Africa and Europe and South America, perhaps the time has come for us to act on this great menace to our nations, to our governments, to our peoples, and to our children. Thank you and good morning.
Thank you very much, José de Valencia.